Here's a breakdown of why Israel is bombing Gaza, killing over 132 Palestinians and counting. Part 1, the timeline. Let's go over the sequence of events to understand how we got here. First, Sheikh Jarrah. Early this year, Israel issues illegal eviction notices to the Palestinians living in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, giving way for extremist Israeli settlers to literally steal the homes of these Palestinians who have been living there for decades. And then the protests began. Palestinians began peacefully protesting at Sheikh Jarrah to defend the Palestinians and encourage the Israeli government to not move forward with the evictions. Of course, the protesters were met by the Israeli occupation forces with violence, baseless arrests, and skunk water, a chemically advanced form of sewage water, being sprayed all over the protesters and the homes of the Palestinians. The Palestinians continued to peacefully protest, and what was Israel's reaction? The Al-Aqsa attacks. During the holy month of Ramadan, Israeli occupation forces used weapons to violently attack the Palestinians praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque. While these Muslims are in the middle of standing in prayer, Israeli forces begin to shoot rubberized steel bullets, throw stun grenades and smoke grenades outside as well as inside the mosques while they're praying. The attacks are still happening right now on and off, but in the first 3 days alone, over 600 Palestinians were injured and in need of medical help. And then widespread protests broke out. Palestinians in Israel, the occupied West Bank, and occupied Gaza began peacefully protesting against the Al-Aqsa attacks and the Sheikh Jarrah evictions. These protesters were also met by Israeli occupation forces with stun grenades, smoke bombs, and rubberized steel bullets. And then, after all these blatant offensive attacks, the only defense force Gaza has, Hamas, officially asks Israel to stop attacking Al-Aqsa. They warn them that if Israel continues to attack Al-Aqsa, a place of worship, that Hamas will retaliate against Israel. Mind you that this is after Israel had already injured hundreds of Palestinians in Al-Aqsa, and Hamas responded to defend the Palestinians. So what does Israel decide to do? Attack again. Twice as hard, injuring twice the amount of Palestinians in the first attack. They even took the keys to all the doors in Al-Aqsa from the Palestinians, and they literally have control over the mosque now. So as Hamas said they would do if the Israelis didn't stop attacking the Palestinians, in defense, they fired missiles at Israel. Even after the warning they gave Israel. And as a consequence, Israel reports 1 injury from the missiles. And then as they always do, Israel plays victim like they weren't the ones that injured 600 plus Palestinians in Al-Aqsa, were using excessive police brutality at all the protests, and began bombing Gaza hard. On the first day alone, 20 Palestinians were killed, 9 of which were children. They're bombing homes, entire apartment complexes, hospitals, mosques, targeting civilians left and right, literally no limits. To add to the violence, because now Israelis all over are emboldened by these bombings, Palestinians in the West Bank and Israel start getting attacked not only by the Israeli occupation forces, but also by random Israeli civilians. These armed extremist Israeli settlers begin forming mobs in the streets, carrying knives, handguns, and rifles, chanting death to all Arabs. They're blocking roads so they can stop cars of Palestinians and beat them up. They set a Palestinian house full of children on fire, critically injuring all the children. Israeli civilians are doing all that. And who starts getting arrested? The Palestinians, of course. The victims of these crimes are the ones getting arrested. It's so corrupt that the Israeli occupation forces are actually present while these attacks are happening. They're literally forming walls around the civilians to protect them while the civilians are attacking the Palestinians. So at this point, the Palestinians literally have nobody to protect them, not even the police. They've become so violent that 12 Palestinians have already been murdered in the streets of Israel and the West Bank. And Israel continues to bomb Gaza all day and all night. And as of today, May 15th, the death toll in Gaza has reached 132 dead Palestinians, nearly half of which are children. Children, y'all. But that's not enough for Israel, no. They've announced now that they're preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza. They have 9,000 Israeli militants waiting at the border of Gaza, ready to occupy and start killing, not just by air, no, but by air and ground now. And their reasoning behind all this is they're doing it in defense to protect their people from the violent Palestinians. But wait, how did this all start? Sheikh Jarrah, who's ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah? Israel. Who's attacking the peaceful Palestinian protesters? Israel. Who attacked and injured over 600 Palestinians at Al-Aqsa? Israel. Who rejected a peaceful request to stop attacking Al-Aqsa? Israel. But this is all defensive, somehow. I don't know. And now part 2. Israel's control of Gaza. Since 1967, Israel has had full control over the West Bank and Gaza, which is illegal under international law. In 2005, Israel imposed an ongoing blockade to maintain control over all of Gaza's borders, controlling all movement in and out of the country, whether by land, air, or sea, effectively trapping all 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. Hence why people call Gaza the largest open-air prison in the world. Since then, they've consistently bombed Gaza every few years, killing thousands of innocent Palestinians, including women and children. In 2009, Israel bombed Gaza and killed over 1,300 Palestinians. They bombed again in 2014, killing over 2,200 Palestinians, and over 10,000 were injured. In 2018, they bombed again, killing 168 Palestinians. In 2019, they bombed again, killing 20 Palestinians. And to add to that list, now in 2021, 132 Palestinians killed in Gaza. And that's as of today. They're still bombing, so there's definitely gonna be more. So in the past 12 years alone, how many people were killed? And who's committing these massacres? Not the Palestinians. So you tell me who's a terrorist state at this point. And finally, part 3, why this isn't a conflict. Everyone wants to talk about Gaza's first airstrikes, but not consider everything else that Israel had done before that. And they tried to reason with Israel, but they continued to attack Al-Aqsa. Let's compare the power dynamic between the two side by side. Army, Palestine, none. Israel, 513,000 personnel. Navy, Palestine, none. Israel, 20,000 personnel. Air Force, Palestine, none. Israel, 89,000 personnel. Military budget, Palestine, 0. Israel, $20.5 billion annually. Does that even include the $3.8 billion of aid that the US sends Israel every year? Gaza isn't some wealthy first world resort. Because of Israel's illegal blockade, which has been condemned by the UN, of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, 82% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty, 2/3 of Gaza's water supply has been wiped out. Israel has control of their electricity, so most Palestinians get 4 hours of electricity every day. They have no health care and a shortage of medical supplies because Israel blocks all shipments into the country. And almost half of the 2 million people that live there are under the age of 14. Those are the people supposedly attacking Israel right now. Israel is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And you're telling me that they're the victims? And that the Palestinians are the villains? What in the colonizer world? Israel has all the power, all the money, all the technology, and one of the most advanced and most funded military systems in the world. They have tanks, grenades, machine guns, an Iron Dome, hundreds of thousands of military personnel waiting to fight for them. And what do Palestinians have? Rocks. Literally rocks. How is it not abundantly clear just how imbalanced the power dynamic is between Palestine and Israel? Israel is only getting started with this massacre of 2021. If all that's been done to Gaza so far has been done by air, I can't even imagine what it's going to be like when they invade by ground. So for the sake of humanity, please help spread the word of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. And not just these solidarity posts, but informative posts, videos, and footage of what Israel is actually doing to Palestinians. Just share and share and share non-stop. All resources and footage of all the crap Israel is doing to Palestine is saved in my highlights, broken down by category, because unfortunately we've come to that point. Please, please, please share. Assalamu alaikum.